We good? We live streaming? All right. Hi, live streamers. Well, good morning. Good to have you all here for another installment of Church in the Round. Not Church in the Round, that's coming up. Of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny. I kind of live in the future. The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Those here in the room, those watching the live stream or a video recording, great to have you here. As always, you can't gather in a church without announcements. So the first announcement, Church in the Round, which I mentioned, is coming up. This is what we do during Lent. We, instead of having large group presentations here in the rec room, there are small group opportunities that last for 5 weeks. And we'll be exploring the book of Psalms. You can sign up. There's a purple card on each table that has a QR code if you want to scan that with your phone and sign up. Or you can actually use the card, fill it out. There's some more on a table outside, or talk to me if you're wondering about questions related to Church in the Round. We'll start that next Sunday. We'll actually start in this room and talk about the Psalms, and it'll be small group glory for 5 weeks. Options are available for Sunday mornings, Wednesday midday, and Wednesday evenings for groups, either in person or via Zoom if you prefer to do it at a distance. There's an interview that supports today's presentation on the book of Esther. I'll refer to it a little bit. I recommend you watch it with Rabbi Josh Stanton, who's a Reform rabbi in Manhattan. Kind of a provocative interview. I'll have more to say about that as we get through the presentation a little bit further. And this is sad news, no Wednesday night discussion this week. Thank you. Because Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and we're going to start to transition into Lent and try to be a little less busy in terms of meetings and things. And we're not going to resume those Wednesday night discussions until May 1st because we've got just some changes around Lent and Easter, which means there's a second announcement slide. So what's happening in upcoming Sundays? You're all here for the book of Esther. For the next 5 Sundays during Lent, we'll be doing Church in the Round on Sunday mornings. So again, there won't be presentations in here, but if you're welcome to come next Sunday, begin in here, and we'll have those small group opportunities. March 24th then will be Palm Sunday, where we don't have an adult ed offering. It's kind of a busy day. March 31st, Easter Sunday. Christ is risen, so you don't have to come to adult ed, I guess, is the hidden message in that. You're set free from that. So we'll take Easter Sunday off. And then for 2 Sundays, April 7th to 14th, we're having an all-church book read. In the past, we've had this in January. We're trying it now during the Easter season. And it'll be 2 Sundays looking at Javier Zambora's memoir, Solito, which I hear great things about. I've not yet read it, but if you're interested in the book read, maybe this is the time to purchase the book and to start reading it. And what's going to happen, April 7th, there will be small group opportunities to discuss the book. And then on April 14th, there's going to be a panel discussion. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong or knows better about this. Margaret's not here yet. A panel discussion about forced migration and refugees from people with firsthand knowledge of what that's like. So that will support the book as well. Does that make sense? Did I pronounce that right? People are nodding, so I'm going to assume that's right. I hope I've got that right, but the panel discussion sounds fascinating on the 14th of April. April 21st, to commemorate Earth Day, we're going to have a presentation along with the Social Justice Forum, so I recommend that. That'll probably be in Westminster Hall. I don't have details on that yet, but Margaret knows them. Earth Day, Westminster Hall, right? Okay. And then finally, April 28th, we will be back in this room for The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny. Margaret's going to lead us into the book of Job. So this is, take a photo of this, plan your life. These are your next several Sundays as we have them planned out. So enjoy Esther today. If you're thinking, I really want more Older Testament, do Psalms, and then you have to hold on a little bit for the book of Job, which is maybe not the happiest book, but one of the more useful books, I think, in the Older Testament in navigating life. All right. So the book of Esther, then, is an interesting book for a number of reasons. And the first thing I want to start off by saying about the book of Esther, it's a book that never mentions God. In other words, the word God never shows up. The Lord, God is not an active character, is one way of describing what's going on in this book, at least in Jewish Bibles and in Protestant Bibles. In Roman Catholic Bibles and in some Eastern Orthodox Bibles, there are references to God. That's because the book was written originally in Hebrew, and then there were additions made to it in later centuries in Greek. And those are the versions that Roman Catholic Bibles translate into English, and also several Eastern Orthodox Bibles translate into English. It adds about 100 verses, and those verses make a point of talking about how what looks like coincidence was really God's direct involvement. You know what I mean? There was probably a nervous editor who thought, this doesn't sound religious enough, so we're going to add some God language in here. But it creates an interesting question for, at least for Jews and Protestants who read a book in the Bible without God being mentioned, is are we supposed to infer God's presence in some way when somebody does something clever, or when something apparently miraculous happens? Do we credit God with that? Somebody has said that circumstance is when God chooses to remain anonymous, or coincidence is when God chooses to remain anonymous. Is that what it's supposed to be about? So it just creates some interesting questions for how we engage the book and how we think about God. So to start us off, here's just a simple discussion question. Should a book be in the Bible if it never mentions God? Which might raise questions for you, even if you've never read Esther. But the question here is, what do we expect the Bible to be? What do we expect the Bible to be about? What kind of information do we expect the Bible to pass along to us? So this is just for about 3 minutes to discuss, either your whole table or with somebody next to you. If you've ended up at a table by yourself, just turn to a different table, whatever. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just kind of, what is this? Is this an odd thing to you to have a biblical book that doesn't mention God? And if you're online, you can use the chat if you want. And I'll call us back in about 3 minutes. All right, I'm going to call us back. And I'm going to keep us moving because I really want to get us into the book of Esther. But what I hope the conversation does is recognize that theology covers a lot of things. Theology is about more than saying, well, God is loving, or God is judgmental, or God is whatever language you want to use about God. That theology also covers the question of how do we interact as human beings. And the book of Esther has a lot to say about things like statecraft as well. How do societies function? Who gets to make decisions? There's a lot going on in Esther, and it's a book that's raised a lot of controversy in different quarters throughout its history, not just because it doesn't mention God, but that is also part of it. People kind of wonder, is this a book that's meant to be taken seriously or not? Because it's a book that is kind of silly and is full of hyperbole, but is also really full of violence and threat and some really disturbing scenes. So it's, like a lot of comedians, it tries to find a way to balance, right, deadly seriousness and hilarity. In the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s. This is a massive archaeological find of basically a library from about the 1st century of a Jewish community. And among the many scrolls found at this site were also scrolls from every book of the Bible, every book of the Jewish Bible, except for one, and it was Esther. And you don't always want to make an argument from silence, but people wonder, why was Esther left out of this otherwise really massive library? It might have been because this particular Jewish community didn't think it was appropriate for some reason. Martin Luther thought that Esther was less worthy of being canonical than any other Old Testament writing. I mean, it's fair to say this was his least favorite book. He also said it celebrates Judaism too much and contains much pagan naughtiness, is the word there. I don't know the original German, but that's at least how it's... So it's a controversial book in a lot of circles. For nobody is it the center of their Bible. For nobody is it the most important book. But it's a real outlier in terms of some of the literature that we've seen so far during this year, and I think that's part of what makes it important. We might also have rephrased this question: can a book be in the Bible if it is satire? If we decide Esther is satire, is that appropriate for Holy Scripture, right? Can God be sarcastic? Can the Word of God be sarcastic? Can it be funny? If any of you ever read the book, The Name of the Rose, or saw that film some time ago, Sean Connery and the other guy who was really young, had a really bad monk haircut. Christian Slater, correct. Yeah, are in that. This is a novel that one of the themes in that story is laughter a good idea? There's a monk who refuses to let monks laugh in this monastery. And his point is, if you let people laugh, they'll stop being afraid. And when people aren't afraid, they'll have no need for faith. So that's its own creepy kind of, thing to think about there, right? But it's this whole question of what do we do with laughter in theological settings. As for Esther, it's a book that is full of hyperbole. It just jumps off the page. It's also a book that's obscene and violent. It's got stories of trafficking of young women. It's got stories of abusive husbands. It's got stories of violence and threats of genocide and just a massive amount of dead at the end of the book. So, like I said, it's a book that's both funny but also has some very disturbing scenes. So just to warn you about that, it's a book that tries to be a satire and a bit of a romp, but at the same time is deadly serious. This is a book that in Jewish communities is read at the festival called Purim, which is one of the annual festivals. If you watch the video with Josh Stanton, which again I'll say more about in a minute, it's about 6 months after Yom Kippur, and Josh follows another rabbi who makes a claim that you've got 6 months apart in the Jewish calendar, the most deadly serious of days, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and Purim, which is this silly day of people dressing up and Purim spiels and these performances that get put on and a lot of laughter and a lot of eating and feasting and drinking. And he says both of these have their own measures of seriousness and humor in them as well. And the book sounds differently from time to time in Jewish communities, right? Depending upon what's going on in the broader community and in Jewish experience. And Josh says more about that. So this is a book that for Christians is in some ways just a bit of an odd book out there, but for Jews it's very much written into the annual calendar and annual celebrations, which explains in part the noisemakers on the table. Right? If you've ever been to a Purim spiel, they are kind of hilarious. There's a lot of costumes. There's a lot of role-playing. There's a lot of mockery of the clergy. There's a lot of mockery of everybody. And there's noisemakers and booing and hissing and cheering and things like that. Without appropriating Purim for ourselves, I just thought some noisemakers would help, at least for the humor part. But before there's any humor, history. Right? So you perhaps have seen the timeline if you've been coming to these in advance. If not, you're like, what in the world is this? Don't worry about that. I can explain afterwards if you want. But basically moving from time from past closer to present, from left to right, the kings are there on the far left, Saul, David, and Solomon. After Solomon, the kingdom divides in two. The northern kingdom's identity and history is essentially lost, or at least scattered, about 720 years prior to Jesus. The southern kingdom, Judah, right, eventually goes into exile there where it's pink, that little strip. And after the end of the exile, Cyrus of Persia, the Persians had defeated the Babylonians to become, the empire in town. They allow Judeans who had been forcibly deported to return back to Jerusalem. And last week, if you were here, Margaret took us into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which talk about the challenges that some of those returnees faced, particularly this priestly class of people who came back to Jerusalem, wanted to rebuild the temple, had to deal with economic pressures, had to deal with political pressures, had to deal with people who wanted to report them to the Persians, right? All of the administrative headache of trying to rebuild a city or a society, but also the religious headache and the way that was, in a sense, dealt with. We're going to skip the Greeks forward. I'm just going to wipe that out of the timeline for now. We're going to stay back here in the Persian period, and I'm going to expand that, look at that, so it's easier to read. And because the book of Esther is set right there, just after, or a couple of decades after, Cyrus of Persia, it says to people who had been deported to Babylon, you're all welcome to go home. Go back to your native lands, go back to where the Babylonians took you from, plant crops, build economies, be sure to send us your taxes from time to time or we'll come and visit. And so a lot go back, but a lot don't. And Esther is a book that reminds us there were Jews who chose to remain in Babylon, just as Jews, pretty much throughout the period from Jesus forward lived in a variety of places in the so-called known world from, Christianity's perspective. And it takes place during the reign of Xerxes the First. So if you've ever, driven into Edina and wondered, what is this Xerxes road? It's Xerxes, who was, there are multiple Xerxes, but Xerxes the Great was a king of Persia. He was one of the sons of Darius the Great. And he is referred to in the book of Esther as Ahasuerus. Wouldn't it be nice if we all just could translate names the same way? But this is moving from the Old Persian into modern. We think the Ahasuerus is the same as Xerxes the First. So Xerxes rules there 486 to 465 before the Common Era. And he rules in Persia. We know about him through other sources. This is a real historical figure. People often wonder how many of these folks can we identify. Nobody else in Esther do we know anything about and doesn't show up in any historical records. But at least the setting of the book during the reign of Xerxes I at this time and in Persia seems to fit a lot of what scholars know about the Persian Empire at that time. We think that Esther was probably written at least 80 years later, maybe longer. Esther was probably written about 400 to 300 before the Common Era. So it's a book that's looking back on Jewish experience in Persia, or in Babylon, which is now part of the Persian Empire. A lot of Jews found it comfortable to stay. They had built lives for themselves. They are engaged in commerce. They're engaged in some ways in the administration of the empire and in politics. And sometimes they're allowed to live as they want. Sometimes they experience persecution. And Esther is a book that worries about persecution. So that's where it comes from. That kind of makes sense in terms of where are we in time and space and all of that. So who are the people then? Or here's when I talk about the size, this is a little hard to see with the shading, but Persian Empire reaches all the way into what we know today as India, way down in the Nile Valley, down to like Kush, these ancient African kingdom. Gets almost as far into Greece. You might have heard stories about the Persians who come and the Athenians who fight them off. That's where we are in history now. They control most of the area on the Black Sea. This is a massive empire. But that right in the middle there, Mesopotamia, right, is kind of the place where all of the capitals of these empires tend to be located. So this is where we're set in terms of place. Who are the people in Esther? Well, here's the cast. This is the playbill for our show today. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes I, in the book of Esther is a moron. But he's also a really dangerous moron and a really violent moron and one who doesn't always think through the consequences of what he says. He's also very easily persuaded by his advisors. No, we're not going to make any connections. We're not going to make any connections to the modern world today. All of that, if it's happening in your own mind, is just happening. I'm just telling the story, folks. Esther, this is where if you have a horn, you should blow your horn, or just say yay. Esther. Queen Esther is the hero. Esther is a Jewish orphan, we learn, and she is raised by her uncle or cousin, whose name is Mordecai. There's Mordecai, who's older than she is. They are Jews who are keeping their Jewish identity undercover in Persia. Right? They know it's not safe for them to identify as Jews, and so Mordecai warns Esther to keep a low profile. There's one more person, and this is where the noisemakers or booing come into play, and that's Haman, or Haman. Very good. So if we were Jews in a synagogue on Purim, we would just be screaming, and you'd be throwing things, and it would be a lot of fun. Haman is an advisor to King Ahasuerus, who is very thin-skinned, very powerful, and rather ruthless, I guess is the best way to describe him. So those are the people, the four main characters. There are some others. And maybe the most important kind of minor character is another queen. Before Queen Esther appears on the scene in chapter 2, there's Queen Vashti. And Vashti is a Persian queen. She's married to King Ahasuerus. And what happens to her in this kind of mini story that occupies Esther chapter 1 in many ways sets the stage for what's going to come in the book, both in terms of its over-the-topness, but also in terms of just how dangerous things are for people in this kingdom when you live at the whim of a reckless king, of a reckless ruler. So in chapter 1, Ahasuerus decides to host a 180-day-long banquet. There are 10 banquets in the book of Esther. You're laughing. That's good. This is supposed to be ridiculous. Who hosts a 6-month-long banquet? Ahasuerus does, who apparently has nothing else to do. And you saw the size of that empire. It says he invites all of his commanders. So it's this idea of a 6-month banquet, drinking fest. And then when that's done, he hosts a separate week-long banquet for Susa, where his winter capital is. And we go through this 7-day banquet, and on the 7th day, so the last day after 6 months and a week of feasting and drinking, on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, right, we should be worried already here, he commanded his eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. Not quite clear exactly what this means, if it's just as simple as like, I want you to walk through here and show everybody how beautiful you are, or if there's something a lot more underhanded here, or a lot more maybe sexual involved in this. It's not exactly clear if the text is understating that, but in any case, he just wants to show off his trophy to the people. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. This is where her story turns. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. So he asked his advisors what he should do. Ahasuerus really doesn't make any decisions on his own in this story. It's a story about just how dangerous it is when somebody gives bad advice to somebody with absolute power. And his advisors say this: Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials. It doesn't say the king, the king's officials, right? This is going to be bad for us. And there will be no end of contempt and wrath. Yay. You can blow your horn, whatever you want. Not clear how funny this is supposed to be, right? I mean, can you really control things like this? But, Ahasuerus certainly tries, and history might suggest that maybe you can. So Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as they proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces declaring that every man should be master in his own house. There you go. So now you know who Ahasuerus is. Vashti disappears from the story. We know nothing else about her from this point forward. Chapter 2 is a scene that's interpreted in some really different ways and some really disturbing ways. Sometimes it's described in this charming way as like a beauty pageant or like some kind of a conquest. And this is where the human trafficking comes in, where the king says basically, I want you, to his advisors, bring me virgins from all around the empire and bring them to me so I can choose the one who pleases me, and she'll become the new queen. And so we're told that basically they go out and they take women from various places in the empire, and one of the people they choose from there in Susa is Esther. And Esther's, and Mordecai, who is Esther's, you should be cheering when I say the word Esther, by the way. And Esther... Esther is told by Mordecai, do not tell anybody you're Jewish. Right? Go do this. Don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. One of the time we're told they're taken into the king. Esther excels with the other people in the court. They all seem to like her. Remember Daniel 2 weeks ago, where Daniel and his friends keep advancing in the court? It's a similar thing like that. Everybody seems to like Esther. Mordecai goes to the palace every day for over a year just to get news about her, to check in on her. So we get a sense of his virtue, that he's making sure she's okay. This is a dangerous place to be, right, in the king's harem and in the palace, especially for her as a Jew. So it's a scene that's odd because it talks about Esther's beauty, and just to give away the ending here, she becomes queen because she is so beautiful and because the king is so taken with her. The way art has portrayed this is quite interesting. It's quite difficult to find kind of medieval European art where Esther's wearing all of her clothing, so I had to look around a while. Kind of like when we talked about Bathsheba, remember, several months ago, the way in which the strong female character has become just deeply sexualized, not just for Ahasuerus, but also for readers or for artists in a lot of the Western tradition. The way the story gets remembered in film is also somewhat terrifying. Here's Esther and the King with Joan Collins back in 1960. I've never seen this, but the photo is interesting enough to me. I've never seen this one either, but from 2006, the story of Esther. The title is One Night with the King, and makes this some kind of a romance as well. I've never seen this one from 1999. This is hard to see. Esther. What I love about this is Louise Lombard, F. Murray Abraham, and Jürgen Prochnow. I mean, these are big names, and so I don't think the story is sexualized in VeggieTales. I've been told it's not. I don't know how they deal with that. They have to cut out some scenes for sure. What? It was juicy in VeggieTales, perhaps. But it's hard to get to the real Esther because of the way she's been remembered in a lot of tradition. You should be cheering when I say the word Esther, by the way. There you go. So she becomes queen, is what happens. We're told, and again, this is over the top. For 6 months, she and all of the maidens, all the other women who are brought into the harem, for 6 months are treated with oils, with fine oils, and then for 6 more months, they go through a perfume and cosmetic treatment. We're not told what this is. This is the worst episode of The Bachelor ever, right? I mean, it's just, and again, the question is this funny? It seems to be trying to be funny, because who spends like a year on, oils and then cosmetics? But it's at the same time deadly serious business as well. Josh Stanton in his video says that there's this interesting pairing between Vashti and Esther, right? Yay. Vashti refuses to denigrate herself before the king, right? And she's punished for it. She's hated because of it. Esther lets herself be denigrated. There you go. Lets herself be denigrated, right? So in the end, it might benefit the community, which might not be a trade we're all willing to make, but at least that's kind of how the story goes with these two, right? Vashti's unwilling to do this. Esther apparently feels like she has no chance or no choice, perhaps, in the matter, and gets brought into this and ends up as queen. Which again is kind of bizarre that like the whole story turns on the fact that somehow this Jewish orphan becomes a queen of Persia. Chapter 2 continues. Mordecai learns that two of the king's servants, there should be an apostrophe there, are planning to assassinate the king. And so Mordecai runs to the castle, gets word to Esther, and we're told this: the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both men were hung on the pole. Both men are essentially crucified or hung. It was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Hold on to that detail. We stay away from the castle then, and we go to chapter 3 and Haman. Very good. You got the noisemakers too if you want. We want to drown out Haman's name, right? Haman is this advisor to the king. He gets promoted for reasons that aren't fully clear, but Ahasuerus promotes Haman. And the king, very good, and the king orders everybody to bow to him when he walks by. You're supposed to bow to Haman. Mordecai, who's an official, kind of more of a low-level official and doing some kind of administrative work, refuses to bow to Haman when he goes by, because as a Jew, he thinks that's kind of beyond the pale, and he refuses to do that. Haman flies into a rage, right? Because there's one man in the city who refuses to bow every time he walks by. So we get a sense of how thin-skinned he is. But then we also get a sense of just how dangerous he is. Haman is furious at Mordecai, and he thought it beneath him to kill only Mordecai. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In other words, because this guy is so thin-skinned, right, and so touchy, that he's not just mad at Mordecai, he says, I'm going to now commit genocide against all of the Jews. I mean, this is, again, some of the ridiculousness of the story, but also the threat that resides within the story, which would be just a massive administrative undertaking, right, think of all that land, all of those people. So this is the plan that Haman, hatches. He's also kind of stupid. He decides that he wants to choose a day for the annihilation, and so he casts lots to determine the day, throws dice, essentially. Purim means dice in Hebrew. That's where the title of the holiday comes from. And the dice come up like several months ahead. Like if you want to do this, you think he would just do it, but he's like, okay, I'm going to commit this, genocide, and we're going to have a specific day for it. But it gives several months now for some counter planning to take place. He easily convinces Ahasuerus. He's like, I'll give some money to the royal coffers. Ahasuerus says, fine, yeah, this is a great idea. I mean, right, this is not a king who's prone to read memos and things like that. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces. You saw how wide that empire was, giving orders to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, children and women, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation, calling on all the peoples to be ready for that day. So the plot is hatched here in chapter 3. In chapter 4, Mordecai tells Esther about the decree. He has to send word to her by messengers because she's queen. And she's afraid of approaching the king to ask about this and to try to stop it without any kind of an invitation or authorization. She says back to Mordecai, it's been 30 days since I've even seen him. Nobody's allowed to go into the king's presence uninvited. And if you do, if he doesn't point at you with his scepter, you're going to be killed. So she's terrified to go and approach this king who's a little bit off the rails. And Mordecai says this is maybe the most famous line in the book of Esther. Mordecai tells Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. See Mordecai's faith in here, right? Like, you can keep silent, it's going to come from somewhere else. But you and your father's family will perish, right? In other words, we're going to eventually die here, right? We're all going, and you as well. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this, right? Perhaps this is the reason why you've been put in place. I mentioned God is not mentioned by name in the book of Esther. This is the moment where people are thinking, aha, maybe this is more than just chance or something like that. So the onus of things is now falling on Esther, who's at considerable risk. Nobody knows she is Jewish. She's not even sure she can approach the king without getting herself killed in the process. And as we've seen, Ahasuerus is not somebody you want to mess with. So chapter 5, she goes to the king, and the king lowers his scepter. He invites her. He receives her. So there's a big sigh of relief. And her plan is not to lay out the whole thing right now. Her plan is to ask to have Haman brought to a banquet. Very good. For just the three of them. He says, what do you want, my love? And she says, I want to have a banquet, just the three of us, you, me, and Haman, which is very savvy, right? Very wise here in what she's doing. And the king, of course, agrees. Ahasuerus agrees to anything that anybody ever says to him. He's really an idiot. Back outside the palace, once again, Haman comes by. Boo. And Mordecai refuses to bow to him. And Haman just goes nuts. And he decides that we should build some gallows just for Mordecai. And he says 50 cubits high, this massive gallows. I think that's 25 meters high. Like, we have this massive gallows, and that he's like, that's where we're going to hang Mordecai when the day arrives. So again, over the top, this guy is so thin-skinned. He hates Mordecai so much. And then he goes and he starts bragging about his invitation to go to a banquet with the king and the queen. Brags to his wife and brags to his friends about how special and how important he is because he's been invited to this banquet. Chapter 6, one night the king can't sleep. I know. And so to put him to sleep, he asks one of his servants to have the book of the annals brought in and read to him out loud. Right, bring me the royal records. This is like, read me the legal code from, Ramsey County or something like that. And what do you think gets read to him? The story of Mordecai, who uncovered the assassination plot. And he says, what did we ever do to thank Mordecai? And they're like, nothing, really. And the king's like, well, that's a shame. And so, that's supposed to say Haman. Sorry. The king, the following day, sees Haman, who's, again, one of his advisors, and he asks Haman, he said, what do you think we should do for a man who has really honored the king? What should we do to reward a person who the king really likes, who's done a good deed for the king? And Haman, it says, in his mind is saying, well, he must be talking about me. And so Haman says, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, So I want king's clothing, I want the king's car, and all this stuff. With a royal crown on its head, let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city. Haman thinks he's being asked what the king should do to reward him. And Haman, instead of asking for like riches or land or anything, says, I just want a parade. Right? I want to wear the king's stuff, I want the king's horse, and I want to be led through the city so everybody can see me. And of course, what ends up happening is he realizes that he's not talking about this. This is what the king wants for Mordecai. And so the king says to Haman, boo. The king says to Haman, here are the robes, here's the horse, give it all to Mordecai, and why don't you lead him through the city? So Haman recognizes things are starting to fall apart. And he goes home, and his wife is pretty much the only one who can see clearly in terms of people around Haman. And here's this beautiful Rembrandt where this is him when he realizes he's got to go like take Mordecai around town on a horse. But his wife says to him, Zeresh, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him, right? She sees what's coming. So this is him at home talking to his wife like, I had a really bad day. And she's like, you're going to have a worse day coming up. And then the very next verse is this. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the trap is closing shut here, right? Again, it's a funny story in its own right. This is probably the most awkward 3-person banquet ever, which I think Rembrandt captures here, where Esther knows what she's going to do. Ahasuerus is like, I got my wife, I got my advisor, I'm stupid. And Haman doesn't know what's going to happen, but he's pretty sure people are on to him. And it's portrayed in a number of ways where the shock of the king, this is my favorite, super dramatic, right? With that. But Esther announces that she is Jewish and also announces that Haman is about to commit genocide, which, of course, the king already knows. The king already signed off on an edict, but he appears to be kind of unaware of that. And so he reveals he's Jewish. Ahasuerus is so angry, he leaves the room for a moment. And while he's gone, Haman starts to beg for his life. And it says that Esther is on her couch, and he comes to her couch to beg. And that's when the king comes in. The king thinks he's assaulting his queen, flies into a rage, and says, what should we do with Haman? Again, this guy can't make any decisions on his own. One of the eunuchs in attendance on the king said, look, the very pole that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high. I happen to know that Haman built these gallows. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hung Haman on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Shakespeare has that line in Hamlet, right, about being hoisted by your own petard, being blown up by your own bomb. In a sense, this is what happens to Haman. And the king calms down. So things are starting to look better, right? Haman and his threat are gone. And then Esther persuades Ahasuerus to let the Jews to live. And there's some confusion about like why it doesn't just happen immediately. It seems like the king thinks, well, I've already decreed it. This is already in motion. I can't stop it. And so what happens then is Mordecai gets elevated in the king's service. By the time the book ends, he's essentially second in command in Persia, which is also a little bit ridiculous that there would be a Jewish queen and then a Jew who's the king's top advisor. But then they persuade the king to send out an edict that permits the Jews to kill the people who were preparing to kill them on the appointed day. So to identify these other kind of anti-Jewish advisors who are out throughout the kingdom and then to kill them. The edict that the king sends out says they're allowed to kill them, but also to plunder all of their property. And twice the book of Esther says that they did not do the plunder. So there's this kind of way of saying, this is not about revenge. This is not about trying to steal as much as this is about delivering oneself from threat from the people who were about to kill them. At least in the rhetoric of the book, that's how it goes. And the book ends with the festival or the Feast of Purim being established. That's the book. That's the story. There's a lot we could say about this. I want to start with just highlighting the courage and the intelligence of Esther. It's not just that she's beautiful, that's how she gets the job as queen, so to speak, but she's also able to act courageously by going into the king uninvited, but also the way she plots the way to expose Haman, which she does on her own without Mordecai's assistance, which is fascinating. In the interview with Rabbi Josh Stanton, he says in the beginning she has nothing else to use but her body, so to speak, to get, as she's now been drawn into this trafficking that the king has demanded. She's willing to do that, even though she has this great mind, and then when she's in a position of influence, she uses her mind to save her people. One of the things Josh says in the video is that one of the lessons of this book is if you're in a position of influence, you have to stand up and try to save your community when threatened. So at the very beginning, right, I said that God wasn't named in the story. There are other Jewish teachers who have said, what's interesting about Esther is there's no prophets, right? There's nobody who stands up and says, thus says the Lord. There's nobody who exposes the truth with divine help. The person who does that, the person who does expose everything is Esther. And the way she does it is not through having like a religious vision or by even having a particular office, but the way she does it is through statecraft, right? The way she does it is through this clever way of manipulating the king's weaknesses, manipulating Haman's own arrogance against him as well, which makes her just a fascinating figure in the story. There are no other stories in the Older Testament about Jewish statecraft that don't involve somehow God saying, I want this, I want that, I want this to happen. But Esther kind of shows how somebody in a position can bring about an ending that saves her people. We also talk about the wickedness, the arrogance, and the stupidity of Haman, who's very good, who's a type, right? He's a ridiculous character, but also an incredibly dangerous character in the story as well. He gets remembered in all sorts of ways, and I mentioned that in Purim celebrations, these are often in conversation with what's going on in the world. One depiction of Haman that's, I think, especially provocative comes from 1950. This is from a Polish Jewish artist named Arthur Szyk, who in the years after the Second World War wrote a lot of kind of cartoonish depictions of Nazis. And so here is his work called The Book of Esther, and just to blow it up, that's the artist himself with the beret sitting there. That's Arthur Szyk, looking over at Haman, who's got swastikas all over him, right, from his shoes and everywhere else. So this depiction, right, of a leader who's vain, of a leader who's dangerous, and who might perhaps get his own. It's just an interesting way in which an artist has tried to depict something utterly horrific, but also with a tinge of comeuppance and a tinge of humor as well. Humor is always a dangerous thing, coming from somebody who likes to think he's funny sometimes, and that sometimes gets him into trouble. Right? It's a delicate thing to joke about violence like this. It reminds me, Mel Brooks, who I believe is still alive, has a line. This is somebody was asking him about The Producers, that show. He says, "That's my job." Right, not just as a comedian, but I think he would say as a Jewish comedian, to make terrible things entertaining. When The Producers came out, you know this story? This is about people who staged basically a musical called Springtime for Hitler? Yeah, it's this. It was, I think, first a film and then became a Broadway show. I think it was remade into a film, I think with Matthew Broderick and some others. But Brooks says when that first came out, he said, I think I got a letter from every single rabbi in the United States complaining about it. And he's like, this is what comedians do. And it's a delicate thing. Maybe you saw Jojo Rabbit several years ago as well. That tries to tell a comedic story and a touching story and a terrifying story all at the same time, set in, is it in Germany or is it in Poland? Anyway, it's during the World War II under the Nazis. So, there are parts of Esther where you might think that's just not funny. And there are parts of it where like, well, it's trying to be funny, right? It comes out of this situation of utter vulnerability. Which gets me to the video. And some of you might have seen the video and some of you might not have seen. So far we've been inviting Old Testament scholars to talk about the books of the Bible. For Esther, we decided to invite a rabbi. Josh would not call himself a biblical scholar, but he's a rabbi in Manhattan, and a friend of mine, which is another reason I invited him, because I knew he would tell us what he really thinks. And I think it's important to hear his views about what makes Esther a story that's always relevant, but relevant in a variety of ways. And again, if you haven't seen the video and want to watch it, I recommend you do. I just want to say Josh doesn't speak for all Jews of all places and all times, and he would be the first to admit that as well. But he does say some things that are hard to hear, I think hard for a Christian to hear, because a lot of what he talks about is the violence that Jews are facing in this country. He talks about this uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. Uptick is too mellow of a word. I think it's like 4 to 6 times the usual. Josh is an interfaith activist. He would be happy to talk about the uptick in anti-Muslim violence and anti-Arab violence. But we asked him to speak to us as a rabbi who's trying to figure out how to minister to a Jewish community in a really difficult time. He's not hawkish, but he's trying to hold a lot of perspectives together in his own community. So he talks a bit about Chuck Schumer. He talks about how Chuck Schumer, this is maybe 3 months ago, gave a speech about anti-Semitism. And he said, that's kind of what Esther's like. He said, here's somebody in a very high office who's Jewish. Schumer's probably the highest Jew currently, and it depends how you're going to rank that. But he's the majority leader in the Senate, right? And he said, he took the time to stop and just say, this is how I perceive anti-Judaism in this country. In other words, how does the story of Esther become, if you're in a position of influence, whatever that is, you have to stand up and try to save your community when given the opportunity, when taking that risk. Josh also says that the story of Esther, one of the reasons it's powerful is, he says, because it's so familiar. He says you just see it lived out over and over again in a number of ways. And he says from his perspective, as somebody in a Jewish community, a diaspora community, somebody who's an other, who kind of feels an acceptance on loan, he uses a biblical expression, being like a driven leaf, right? He says that's the experience of a lot of Jews, even still in America, where such a huge number of Jews have taken up homes. So to think about it in that way, I'm not going to pretend that this is a Purim spiel. I'm not going to pretend that I can speak for Jews in the United States, let alone worldwide. But it's part of, I think, embracing what this story is about and the power of the story through time, even way beyond the Persian Empire, and how it gets reread or gets reperformed. Purim's coming up in a few weeks. I think it's at the very end of February this year. Back in 2020, a rabbi wrote in the New York Times this. The Purim tale, the story of Esther, right, reminds us that a government and the society it oversees can turn against its most vulnerable in a matter of moments. This is why, and here he's quoting his uncle, another rabbi, this is why Rabbi Joseph argued, Esther's story is no triumphal tale. On the contrary, it is the book of vulnerability of man or of humankind in general, and specifically of the vulnerability of the Jew. I would think as Christians, it's also incumbent on us to try to figure out how does the story expand then, right, to talk about misuse of power in general and vulnerability in general. So again, it's a story that's hilarious. It's fun to use the noisemakers, but it also ends with a lot of heaviness and embodies a lot of heaviness too. So I want to end with this, and this might lead to other questions, but what caught your attention today? Maybe another way of rephrasing that. These are really the same question asked twice. How does the book of Esther, with all of its both ugliness and silliness, sit with you? Right? How do we deal with humor around topics like this? And how do we deal with Esther, who's in many ways a heroine in the story, but also has to endure, as the story goes, right, endure her own degradation to engineer the outcome that she would want in this. This is an open question. The live stream will have to shut off in a few minutes. I think we have a microphone as well if we want to do this out loud in a large group, which is fine with me. We're just going to get the microphone. There is no one single right answer to these questions. I hope that's also. Betty.
What struck me was we're talking about, when we talk about Persia, we're talking about Iran, correct? And Iran, I met
geographically speaking.
Yeah, I met an Iranian American woman last week who was saying that we look at the violence today, the destruction today, the human trafficking today, the subjugation of women today, and how Esther had to use the processes to communicate a message. That what this woman was saying to me is that as humankind, we're still only at the teenage level, that we haven't evolved yet. And so Esther, there are so many women who have to use that process to communicate a message. They have to go through the men to communicate the truth. But Esther was a truth teller. That's what my thoughts.
Yeah, it's still a very familiar story, right? I mean, you can imagine different characters, different land, and same basic story.
I was struck in the story for the first time today that I think if we look in our own political context, so many people want somebody who doesn't compromise, either on whatever side of the spectrum you're looking at. Vashti didn't compromise. And if Vashti had been in Esther's position, the end would have come out a whole lot differently. So Esther compromised herself for the greater good.
Yeah. Yeah. And the question is, how do you call that heroic, right? At what price and what cost to her? Yeah, that's all. Martha, up in the front. Claire. Thanks.
Oh, me. I was going to echo something similar. Why aren't we celebrating Queen Vashti more, especially women? Because she snubbed the king.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty rad. But also I felt like one problem with the retelling of the story is saying when the eunuchs went out to choose the virgins, they were kidnapping these women. So Esther didn't really have her life was over. So I just feel like the retelling too, it was too soft. Like they were taken, all of these women from their families and homes and livelihoods. That's violent. They were kidnapped against their will. So her life was over anyway. Either whatever happened, her life was already over. She didn't have a choice.
Yeah. It is very tame the way the story tells it. Anyone else? Yeah.
I guess the thing that struck me overall is that, as was said previously, this is going on today. The story doesn't seem to change, and we need to lift this up as a way to recognize where we need to step in and be active all the time in our minds. So that it just struck me as it applies today. So.
Yeah. I remembered one thing, too. I heard a sermon on Vashti about 10 years ago that still rings in my head. That just celebrates her as one who kind of refuses to take on the expectations of those around, and also tries to tie that into a larger biblical theme. Because Vashti's easy to forget. She's Persian. She's not Jewish. She's just kind of, at the narrative level, she's just there to illustrate how horrible Ahasuerus is, and it's easy to forget about her. But there is a way in which her memory, I think, is also very much a biblical story. Right?
Well, I was going to talk about the violence at the end of the book, but speaking of Vashti, she sacrificed herself by standing up to the king, and she was exiled. Esther also sacrificed her own sense of self and was degraded, as we said, in order to save her people. Yeah. So I think they're kind of like the flip side. One succumbed and saved, was a hero, and one didn't succumb and was a hero, but they both sacrificed themselves in different ways. Yeah. My question is, when you tell the story to children, we talked about the Daniel and the lion's den and what do you do with children? When my kids who go to a Jewish preschool were retold this story, it ended before the Jews killed all the other people. And my question is, why couldn't the book have ended in, hey, the Jews are saved, everybody went about their business, isn't life grand? there's this ugliness at the end, this revenge, that really bothers me.
Yeah. I'll say one thing about that in just a sec, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I was going to respond to that same sentiment there. You were saying this Haman character is familiar, and I'm thinking of in Shakespeare, Malvolio, who's a famous example of pride goeth before the fall. And when you watch Twelfth Night, the audience enjoys seeing Malvolio fall, be brought low, laid low. He's treated horribly, he's imprisoned. But then Shakespeare adds a scene at the end when Malvolio returns and says, "No man should be treated this way."
Yeah. The Westminster fifth graders several years ago did put on I'm looking at Brent because his daughter played Esther. This is what, maybe 8 years ago? Something like that, maybe even more. It was done as a silent film. And it's kind of hilarious, but also really kind of, it captures the danger of the story. I can't fix the ending, and I don't say this to try to fix the ending. Some interpreters have pointed out that that what's going on there is this idea of how do you get rid of a violent threat against one's own people, like how much of this is self-protection, how much of that is also supposed to be read somewhat hysterically, where is Esther becoming, in a sense, like Ahasuerus, and the idea of, well, I've got power, so I'm going to use it. Could be kind of a warning sign. In the interview with Josh, he talks about the way in which that kind of humor allows you to entertain for a while, like a revenge fantasy, and to kind of explore that morally in one's own mind and think is that what I want, right? Or is that what's required? And some of that might have to do with how humor works. And I don't like to analyze humor because then you ruin it. But yeah, there's something in that ending that's disturbing. I've also heard that there are, and I don't know the details of this, and I wasn't able to find a cantor who could answer the question, but I recently heard a Jewish scholar say that in some performances of Esther, where it's often sung, and the cantor will often vocalize those parts almost as a lament. You know what I mean? So in the performance of it, there's a kind of criticism of what's going on as well. And that all depends, I think, upon what synagogue and what time and what place and who's, what's going on in the world around folks. I think we have time for one more. And then, was there one more? Hand? All right, important story, weird story, funny story, awful story, really important story to our Jewish neighbors, good story to know about. Psalms, 5 weeks of Psalms coming up next. So we can all pray for forgiveness. And are you booing Psalms? Cheering the Psalms, all right. Thank you for being here today and for your playing with the noisemakers to gratify me. Thanks, PJ.